Hello and welcome to African Chess Lounge. Here's another series of our understanding episodes. Today we're going to look at an opening called the Barrier Attack and essentially try and understand the ideas behind it and how to play it. It's a very difficult opening to face in practice. It's not easy, although like for a prepared opponent it's highly unlikely that white will obtain a huge advantage. So this makes it a very powerful weapon, especially at club level, because people don't really study thoroughly. So it's worth understanding what you're doing when you're playing against it. Let's look at the board and look at it and see what you have to do and what you have to understand basically in order to play it or against it. Okay, so the game we're going to use is I think one of the earliest games in the system, and Hebden, after losing this game, went on to become one of the best practitioners of this opening. So I think it made a huge impression on him, and we'll look at what mistakes Black made in this game, which cost him. So after d4, knight f6, knight f3, here Black indicates that he wants to play some sort of either King's Indian attack, King's Indian defense, or Grunfeld or something like that. So if you go c4 here, what's going to happen is Black will either play, let's say you go c4, Black will play something like this, and you're either going to play the Grunfeld or you're going to play the King's Indian castles here, let's say. And after e4, d6. Either one of these openings is very intensive in terms of opening preparation and what you have to know. So most club players, after d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, in order to avoid these kind of things, will play something like knight c3, which is a very narrow repertoire, but they would know everything about it. So if you as Black are not prepared for these sidelines, you're going to struggle, and they are not just random. They are exact systems which have been honed in for years, and you can easily fall for a quick loss in these setups. In the game, after knight c3, Hebden plays d5. And white continues bishop f4. He wants to play e3, but the bishop has to be outside the pawn chain. A similar idea you see in the London system. Bishop g7, e3, castles, and white goes bishop e2. Okay, this is the starting point for the tabia, really, for the barrier attack. And here the outlook is quite calm, and there's nothing as violent in sight. But the truth is, actually, white has got a very barbaric approach to this opening. He wants to push h4, h5 and attack that way. He just needs to prepare for it, but that's really at the end of the day what he's trying to do. And this is pretty much the idea or the plan in most of the positions, except I think when Black plays c5, then by putting pressure on the center, it makes it very difficult for white to press the usual way. So the one thing that a barrier attack player needs to know is that in cases where this c5 idea gets played properly, you have to be obviously prepared for a long game which goes into the end game. Of course, Hebden is an like equipped chess player. He goes c5, and this is the most I think accurate counter to this setup. You could play c6 here, at which point white just continues with h4, and the h5 is coming. Or you could play bishop g4. And here, white would continue with knight e5 with the same plan. You could play b6. Again, knight e5 with the same plan would ensue. And you know, if you are studying this opening, these lines would be worth looking at later on in the course of studying chess. But this is a good place to start. After c5, knight e5, black goes b6, and I think this is a small minor mistake. When white starts doing this, you need to be able to counter these actions by playing something like knight c6, and you're already putting pressure on the center. If you need to, you'll be able to exchange, and this would be the right way to go about it. But b6 is a bit slow to counter what white is doing, so white takes advantage and plays h4. And here, of course, he wants to play h5, and you really don't want to play the move h5 yourself, because then it weakens the king side, and it will become easy for white to maybe play something like g4, pressing again and continuing the attack. So black comes up with an idea. In chess, there is a concept that if you are being attacked on the wing, you must react in the center. And the way black does this is not as effective as he was expecting. He goes bishop a6, trying to exchange some minor pieces so that he can reduce the effect of the attack. Now I want you to think, let's say you're white in this position, pause the video just a minute and see what would you play. Okay, I think I've given you enough time. Let's say you pause the video. So you know that black is trying to exchange a minor piece. So your approach would be to avoid that exchange and just play bishop f3. Okay, this is very important to know, that if you are the person who's attacking, try to avoid exchanges. So by playing bishop f3, he avoids this light squared bishop. Yes, he can castle the king side, but he doesn't intend to castle on the king side anyway. So bishop f3, he keeps the light squared bishop. The light squared bishop in this position, if you look, it's the good bishop for white. It's not impeded by his own pawns, and it's very important when you start pressing on the king side, it's going to become useful. So black goes bishop b7, accepting that what he had done was not the best, but this just gives white a tempo to play h5. If he takes, he opens the king side. He doesn't want that, so he decides, okay, let me follow the policy of exchanging as many minor pieces as I can. So white opens lines. Very important if you are attacking that you have open lines towards your opponent. And he goes fg6. Now this move, just like any move you make with pawns, creates weaknesses. Now he's got these central light square weaknesses. This is very important to understand, because everywhere where you have a weakness, the opponent can use it to get into your position. So he could have played h6, and when you're analyzing games and studying games, you must look at these alternatives, because you could just end up with a one-sided view of how the game went. But the problem with this is that white would be able to play bishop g4, and the problem is that if you take, he brings in the queen quite early and plays queen h3, you've got mating threats. And sorry, if you don't take, he's going to play queen to f3 and queen to h3, still with an attack. So very nice move. In the game, he takes, now the queen comes in, he's threatening on d7. And now, oh, sorry. In the game, what happened was that he took with the f pawn, of course, And then after bishop g4, took on g4, queen takes g4. Now there's threat of queen e6 check, and that wins material, and potentially has got problems with mate. So he plays rook f5. So you get it. The basic threat that is here is, let's say you play something like knight f6. There's check, and after this you have the classic not only threat of losing a queen, but you've got a classic mate here. But after rook takes, queen takes, this is just lost for black, so you don't want that. So that's why here after this he plays rook f5. Rook f5 blocks the queen. So now white has to figure out how to continue his attack. So he goes queen h3. Very nice move, very simple also. And black has to play knight f8. Now you can't play this because now check, king move, rook takes, and you still have got this idea, losing the queen. Could even play it before rook takes. You could even just go knight check, and this would be lost. But definitely rook takes is much better because there is no check or counterplay here. Okay, so he goes knight f8, and now white goes g4. Now the rook is lacking space on the king side. It's very hard to even suggest where to go here with the rook, because if you go rook f6, there is a bishop g5, and the position is increasingly becoming uncomfortable for black. In the game, he took on f4 with the rook, and after e takes f4, he takes on d4. So for the rook, he gets a minor piece plus a pawn, which in some positions will be sufficient. But the problem is the piece that he exchanged is one of his most active pieces, so it's not really helping. White continues knight e2, and after knight e2, black plays g5. So black is banking on the idea that the pawn cannot take because the knight hangs on e5. White plays queen h5. Very simple idea. He wants to play queen to f7 check, and if the king moves, there's potentials for moves like knight g6 check with the attack. So after queen h5, he goes queen d6. This defends against the idea of knight g6 check. Queen f7 check, king h8, and now white brings in the castle by castling long. There's too many pieces around the white king, so black decides, since he's getting a pawn here, he takes fe5, queen e5, and they trade off these pawns like this. And now after knight d4, he goes queen g7. So this is the best way for him to prevent a continuing attack against his king. But as you can expect, he's just headed into a lost endgame. Now at this point, it's important to understand that the nature of the game has changed. Something that a lot of players miss when they're playing, which is a transition from attack, attack, attack. You've used your attack at this point to obtain an endgame advantage. And it's important to start thinking about the endgame as an endgame. And to recap, if you haven't seen some of our material before, there are basically two plans in the endgame. Number one, push your pass pawns. Number 2, attack weaknesses to create pass pawns. Now, in the endgame, it's also important to understand that there are only 3 weaknesses: isolated pawns, backward pawns, and advanced pawns. Now, in this position, black does not really have an isolated pawn, but he has these backward pawns. These are very important in the endgame because you'll be able to press this. It doesn't really have an advanced pawn, but these 2 are your starting point. So after king g7, you have to be thinking, okay, good, how do I proceed, right? Now, in the endgame, there's also a way of thinking which is not the same usually in the middle game. In the endgame, you attack weaknesses, whether they are defended or not. You just keep attacking them. Eventually, things will start cracking. I think that's the best guide at the beginning to have. So here you'll notice that white plays rook d e1. Yes, this can be protected, but he attacks it anyway. And after rook d1, he goes rook to e8. Okay. Now this might not seem like a big deal, but in an endgame way of thinking, this is very important. Your rook is active, his rook is passive. That's really what you're aiming for. So here, white goes knight to rook to h5. Now, someone might say, oh, why not knight e6 check, exchanging these minor pieces since he is ahead in material. Now, an interesting way of looking at it is that if you compare these 2 knights, this knight here is much more annoying than that knight. So why would you exchange a good knight for a bad knight? So that's why he plays rook h5, attacking g5, and in some cases getting ready to pile up on this pawn on h7. So rook h5, king g6, very logical. It also comes out of this potential check, and he goes knight f3, putting more pressure on this pawn. And here was thinking even rook e5. It's very strong. Just shows you how hopeless this position is for black. Anyway, the move he plays is not bad. Knight to f3, and h6 is played, protecting the pawn. And now white goes knight e5 check. Now this knight is better than it was before in black's position. So he goes king to g7, and here rook e1. Again, what you're doing is you're constantly attacking the weaknesses, the 3 weaknesses we spoke about: backward pawn, isolated pawn, and advanced pawn. And in this position is only 2 really. I'm not even speaking about a7 because it's so far away and it's not so easy to attack. But it's good to be aware that it exists there. So he goes d4. Okay, you don't rush to take the pawn because here he's just opened for the bishop against the rook. So rook 1 h2, and now rook c8. Okay, so here he realizes something. He could take here, but the problem is bishop e4 would create counterplay. So the bishop coming to e4 here would be attacking c2, and it would be very tricky to deal with that. And there will be even threats of d3. So here after rook c8, he goes f4. The weakness is there, it's permanent, it's not going anywhere. So here he does this, and after f4, it's a bit of a tactical solution, but it works in this particular case. gf4, sorry, rook f5, and now it goes knight g6. Of course, you want to exchange this g6 and take on f4. Okay, so now things have changed a little bit. Now we've got an isolated pawn on h6, we've got a backward pawn on e7. So black goes e5, trying to get rid of the backward pawn. White rook f5, putting pressure on the backward pawn. And here black goes rook to c5. Okay, pressure. Sorry, rook f, h5, putting pressure on the backward pawn. That's how you play the endgame. It's not really complicated. You just keep doing the same. Bishop e4. And I mean, it's amazing how black has really kind of fought in this position. His opponent is not let down. He has actually struggled as much as he can to stay in the game. Rook check. King goes to g5. Rook h8. Okay, it's always important in rook endings that you don't use your rooks to defend pawns, rather keep them active. And here he has to make this tough decision by playing rook g8, rook h8, king takes, and rook goes to f8. This is to cut off the king on the king side so that it doesn't interfere on the king side, on the queen side. Bishop f3, king goes to d2, pawn to e4. It's looking a bit scary. Looks like these pawns can be very dangerous. White attacks the back pawn, and black defense. Like what black is doing is exactly what you should avoid, because I think here black had a little chance which he should have tried to use to his benefit. I think he should have maybe tried e3 check, and after king d3 played king g3, and I think this is not looking good, which goes on to show you that no matter how bleak it is, like in chess, you really have to keep your guard on, because opportunities might come, and this was, I think, an opportunity for black. Anyway, he missed it. He just violated the principle and played rook c4, and now it's looking good for white again. After b3, rook c7, rook takes d4. Now these pawns are not mobile anymore. King goes to g3, rook h8, keeping the rook as active as possible. King goes to f2. Now he's ready to shepherd this pawn, and white goes rook e8. I'm wondering if he had played rook e7 here, white would have just simply blocked the pawn like this. So each move had its problem. So he goes rook e8, rook g7, and now simple technical conversion. He takes the pawn, rook d takes e4, and bishop takes e4, rook takes e4. Now this is still very instructive for the average chess player, because even after this, it's not easy to just convert this position. And one disservice I feel happens in chess is that you get a position like this, and then the author will say, well, the rest is a matter of technique, there's no need to explain this, but it's very important that as a player you really understand what's happening. So after rook e4, the king is still cut far away from this pawn, so that's one advantage, very important one. White has an extra pawn, that's the second advantage. Not usually very relevant in rook endings, but you've got two clear advantages. And you can work with this, and black really has no compensation for these advantages. So after rook e4, rook to d7 check, king c3, here goes king f3. So now, if you understand these advantages we just spoke about, it's very important that the king is not allowed to cross this barrier. So he goes rook e8. Okay, you're not always going to be able to prevent him from crossing for the rest of the game, because you need the rook later on. But for now, as you set up your pieces, it's important that you keep this barrier on. So after rook e8, rook c7 check, no need to hurry, king b2, just king f4. Now this is the pawn that is keeping you busy with the king, so you go c4, king f5, king c3, he goes b5. Okay, this is one of the techniques of these positions, is you must try and exchange pawns. Okay, here it won't really make a difference. Rook e2, king f4, king d4. Now white's threat is to play c5, not necessarily exchange. He wants to push the pawn, create a pass pawn. So he goes king d4, b takes c4, b takes c4, rook d7 check, he goes king c5. So far so good. King f3, we keep the king shielded. Rook e6. At the same time, our position of the rook is very important. Sometimes we can use this to prevent the rook from being active. So rook e6, he goes rook c7 check, we go king d5, he goes king f4, and we push the pawn c5, king f5, and we keep the king outside. Rook e2, he goes rook d7 check, and now king c6, he goes rook h7, and we go king d6. Again, we're going to push this pawn further. A very nice game from Pirc. A terrible loss for Hebden, but it's not a coincidence that after this game, Hebden became one of the best practitioners of the barrier attack, and I think this game made a huge impression on him. And a very nicely played game, instructive, and at least shows you the basic ideas of the barrier attack. I hope that was instructive for you and you learned something and you can use it. And if you did, I hope us support the channel by liking it and subscribing and even recommending it to others. We'd really appreciate, we enjoy what we do, and with your support we keep making these videos. Thank you.